Urban environments like to pretend they are complete. They give us roads, junctions, crossings, signs, railings, cycle lanes, curbs, traffic lights, painted arrows, barriers, bollards, bus lanes, pedestrian zones, loading bays, CCTV poles, delivery routes, industrial estates, shopping parks, office blocks, underpasses, flyovers, fenced off wasteland, and every other little instruction manual on movement. It tells us where to go, when to stop, how to cross, where to wait, what counts as a proper route and what counts as inconvenience or strange behaviour. And yet, every city has cracks. Not only cracks in the literal pavement, though those matter too, the weed pushing through the concrete is always a minor philosopher of our civilization, but there are also cracks in the logic of the city. A gravel path behind a warehouse, a dirt lane under a railway bridge, a forgotten trail beside a canal, a muddy cut through between estates, a patch of woodland hidden behind the retail park, a towpath that quietly stops pretending to be civilised. These are the places where the city phrase. They are not wildernesses in the grand romantic sense. There are no alpine vistas, no cinematic drone shots over endless forest, no heroic summit conquered by a sweating protagonist with a carbon bike and a hydration strategy. Instead, there is leftover land. There are brambles, puddles, nettles, broken bricks, tyre tracks, dog walkers, old desire paths, dumped pallets, wet leaves, graffiti, and a strip of dirt that nobody officially designed, but everybody somehow understands. This is where the urban escape artist lives. The escape is not a dramatic departure from civilization. It is not packing the bike into a van and driving 3 hours to somewhere branded as adventure. It is smaller and more subversive than that. It is the act of leaving the city without fully leaving it. It is finding the hidden dirt folded inside the urban fabric. It is discovering that the grid, for all its arrogance, has edges. It leaks. A fixed gear bike makes this discovery more interesting because it is often imagined as the creature of the city. The fixed gear bike belongs supposedly to tarmac, traffic and timing. It is a machine of hard surfaces and hard decisions. It has the aesthetic of compression, one gear, one chainline, one ratio, one continuous relationship between legs and rear wheel, no coasting, no mechanical pause, no little pocket of absence in which the rider can switch off and let the bike drift. The cranks keep turning, the pedals keep returning, the drivetrain insists on your attention. On smooth urban roads, that insistence feels like part of the system. The bike fits the grid because both are made of rhythm, repetition, and constraint. The rider learns to read traffic lights, parked cars, junctions, potholes, pedestrians, wet drain covers, and the small betrayals of tarmac. Speed is not simply produced by power, it is managed through anticipation. A fixed gear rider moving through the city is always calculating, even when the calculation has become bodily rather than conscious. When to ease pressure, when to resist the pedals, when to carry momentum, when to let cadence rise, when to slow the bike without panicking, when to trust a gap and when to abandon it. The whole city becomes a moving equation written in buses, curbs and brake lights. But Tracklocross disturbs the neatness of that image. It takes the urban-coded drivetrain and drags it out through the cracks, into mud, gravel, grass, roots and raw loam. It asks what happens when the machine of the grid meets the disorder of dirt. It asks what happens when a bicycle built around precision is forced to negotiate uncertainty. It asks what happens when the rider cannot coast through the threshold between surfaces but must pedal, feel and adapt the entire way. That threshold is the real subject. Not the city alone, not the dirt alone. The power sits in the transition. The moment the front wheel leaves asphalt and drops onto gravel, the moment road hum becomes crunch. The moment a painted cycle lane gives way to a neat canal path, slick with leaves. The moment concrete becomes soil and the entire body has to change its body language. On a freewheel bike, this transition can be softened. You can coast into it, let the bike glide for a second, settle yourself, choose a line, reset. On a fixed gear bike, that transition is continuous. The cranks do not wait while the landscape rearranges itself. There is no easier gear for uncertainty. The change of surface enters the body immediately. This is why fixie transitions between city and dirt feel so tactile. The rider does not merely observe the terrain, the rider is mechanically implicated in it. The chain transmits more than force, it transmits mood. Tarmac gives one kind of feedback, hard, clean, predictable, fast. Dirt gives another, granular, shifting, damp, resistant, sometimes generous, sometimes treacherous. The fixed drivetrain turns those differences into sensation. The bike becomes less like transport and more like an instrument with poor manners. It speaks through the pedals, through the rear wheel, through the little slips and catches that arrive before thought has time to dress itself properly. On high friction pavement, control can feel sharp and confident. The tyre bites, the line holds, acceleration has a clean response. The rider can push against the drivetrain and feel the city answer with speed. There is a compact pleasure in this. The machine feels honest, no suspension clouding the system, no gears smoothing out effort, no freewheel creating distance between intention and movement. Every decision arrives quickly. On dirt, that same honesty becomes more complicated. Low traction refuses arrogance. Too much force through the pedals and the rear wheel skips or spins. Too much stiffness in the body and the bike starts ricocheting from rut to rut like a nervous shopping trolley. With too little commitment, the rider stalls, especially in climbs where the chosen ratio suddenly feels less like minimalist purity and more like a tiny mechanical insult. The fixed gear demands a different kind of control here. Not domination, but negotiation. This is one of the most interesting things about tracklocross. The machine is rigid, but the rider cannot be. The body has to become adaptive, elbows soften, knees become suspension, hips shift, hands loosen, weight moves subtly backwards and forwards. The rider learns to pedal through roughness without stamping on it. Momentum becomes precious, cadence becomes a form of listening. The fixed drivetrain does not allow the rider to disengage from the ground, but neither does it allow the rider to simply overpower it. Dirt punishes the fantasy of total control. It invites something more intimate and more intelligent, responsive control, partial control, and conversation as control. This is where our fixed gear bike becomes strangely poetic. It carries the rider from one world of friction into another. Asphalt is not frictionless, of course, but its friction is familiar and controlled. It is engineered friction, planned friction, friction that has been domesticated by our councils. Dirt is more unruly. It changes with rain, season, shade, use, neglect, and mood. It holds memory. A path ridden in summer becomes an entire thing in winter. A dry line becomes a bog. A firm corner becomes betrayal. A climb that felt possible last week becomes a slow motion argument with gravity and clay. To ride fixed through these transitions is to feel the instability of surfaces without a buffer. The city grid may offer the fantasy of order, but the hidden dirt reminds us that the world was never truly smooth. Smoothness is an expensive fiction. Someone built it, maintains it, sweeps it, marks it, polices it, and sells it back to us as convenience. Dirt does not pretend in the same way. Dirt declares itself. It says, here is resistance, here is texture, here is uncertainty, here is the place where your body returns to the discussion. And that return matters because modern movement is often designed around reducing sensation. Cars isolate us from weather, sound, and effort. E-bikes, suspension systems, navigation apps, smartwatches, performance analytics, and endless layers of equipment can all be useful, but they can all also create distance. They can turn movement into management. They can make the world feel like something to be processed rather than encountered. The fixed gear tracklocross bike moves itself in the opposite direction. It does not make the ride easier in any obvious sense. It removes options. It narrows the machine so the experience widens. That is another paradox of riding tracklocross. In its one gear, it opens the landscape more than many gears. This is not to say that the tracklocross bike is the most efficient tool for every situation. It clearly is not. There are moments when a gear bike would be more sensible, faster, more comfortable, more capable, and less ridiculous. But sensibility is not always the point. Sometimes the limitation is the lens. A fixed gear bike turns surfaces into events. It makes the city to dirt transition dramatic, not through speed or spectacle, but through your attention. The rider cannot simply consume the route, we have to inhabit it. This is why the idea of an urban escape artist works so well as a frame for cycling. It does not treat the ride as a product test, it treats it as a way of seeing. The question is not merely whether a fixed gear bike can handle dirt, the question is useful but limited. A better question is, what does this kind of bike reveal about the spaces we move through? What does it show us about the city? What does it change in the rider? What forms of freedom appear when the machine refuses comfort and the route refuses neatness? The answer begins with the margins. The most interesting urban dirt is rarely presented as a destination. It is not signposted with adventure branding. It exists in overlooked corridors and unofficial passages. It lives behind fences, along canals, through scrubland, under bridges, beside railways, across abandoned lots, around the edges of car parks, between industrial estates, and along the desire lines made by people who refuse to take the long way round. These places are neither fully urban nor fully rural. They are ambiguous. They make planners uncomfortable because they are difficult to categorise. They are not beautiful in the conventional sense, and they possess a rough charisma. They are the city's subconscious. Riding through them on a fixed gear bike creates a particular kind of intimacy. You are not floating above the terrain on a machine designed to erase it. You are not attacking it with a full suspension apparatus of conquest. You are feeling your way through a brutally simple tool. The bike does not flatten the difference between surfaces, it amplifies a curb, a puddle, a patch of loose gravel, a muddy rut, a broken bit of concrete, a root crossing the path at the wrong angle. Each becomes meaningful, each tells us something important, and that is that freedom is not always elsewhere. This matters because cycling culture often sells escape as distance. Escape is the mountain pass, the gravel epic, the remote bothy, the foreign tour, the expensive bikepacking setup, the long weekend carved out of normal life. There's nothing wrong with these things. They can be wonderful, but they can also turn freedom into a product category, something requiring equipment, time, money, travel, and the correct aesthetic. The urban escape artist offers another model. Escape may be local, it may be awkward, it may smell faintly of dirty water, it may begin right at your front door, behind a supermarket, just past the broken glass. That is a more democratic kind of adventure. Not pure, not polished, not market ready. It does not need mountains, it needs attention. A fixed gear bike intensifies it because it is also a rejection of excess. Again, this should not be inflated into a grand moral superiority. Riding fixed does not make someone spiritually cleaner than a person on a geared bike. The bicycle industry touches supply chains, marketing, consumption, and fashion, no matter how stripped back the machine looks. But there is still value in the experience of reduction. There is value in choosing a machine that cannot solve every problem for you. There is a value in limitation when it sharpens perception rather than merely becoming an aesthetic pose. The countercultural narrative of fixed gear riding has always been dependent on this tension. Fixed gear culture has roots in messengers, alley cat races, DIY builds, urban speed, minimal maintenance, small workshops, and anti-fashion fashion, and the refusal to treat the bicycle purely as a sensible transport appliance. It has often carried a certain stubbornness, sometimes productive, sometimes performative, sometimes both at once. Tracklocross evolves that story by taking the same stubborn drivetrain into spaces where its inadequacy becomes part of the appeal. The escape from the city grid is therefore not simply geographical, it is symbolic. The grid represents a certain organisation of life. Efficiency, predictability, optimization, authorised movement, measurable progress, ride here, stop there, follow the route, improve your average speed, upload the data, compare the segment, buy the upgrade, reduce friction, increase output. Become a tidier version of yourself. Hidden dirt interrupts this script. It refuses smooth optimization. It makes the ride scruffier, slower, less measurable in the ways that supposedly matter. A muddy cut through may ruin your average speed, but sharpen your senses. A loose climb may make you look ridiculous, but teach you how your body responds under pressure. A greasy corner may humble the entire fantasy of control in less than half a second. Dirt is very efficient at puncturing vanity. It has no respect for curated identity. It does not care how clean your drivetrain looked before the ride. It simply asks whether you are present enough to respond. That is the anti-establishment quality worth exploring. Not rebellion as costume, not the tired performance of being edgier than other cyclists. Something quieter and more durable. The refusal to let movement become entirely managed. That refusal to accept that the best route is always the smoothest, fastest, or more official. The refusal to let the city's instructions exhaust the possibilities of the city. To ride from tarmac to dirt is to create a small rupture in the expected use of space. It is to say that a road bike does not have to remain on roads, that an urban machine does not have to remain in the urban script, that a commute-shaped landscape may contain play, texture and uncertainty. It is not revolution, it is not going to bring down the empire of bollards, but it is a meaningful act of reinterpretation, and reinterpretation is often where freedom begins. The phrase urban escape artist also carries a useful ambiguity. An escape artist does not destroy the cage, they learn its mechanisms, they study the locks, hinges, gaps, and weaknesses. Likewise, the fixed gear rider does not reject the city, they become more attentive to it. They learn its timings, its secret passages, its abandoned edges, its overlooked surfaces. They know which underpass leads to a gravel track, which industrial road becomes quiet after 6, which park entrance hides the best muddy descent, which towpath floods after rain, which alley saves 10 minutes and which one contains 3 bins, a cat and a deeply, deeply questionable smell. This is not escape through ignorance, it is escape through knowledge. The bike becomes a method for reading space. A geared travel bike might cover the same route more efficiently, a mountain bike might handle the dirt more comfortably, a road bike might own the tarmac more elegantly, but the Tracklocross bike turns the whole route into one continuous problem. And that continuity is crucial because there is no gear change to mark a change of identity, no suspension mode to activate, no coasting phase to separate urban riding from off-road riding. The rider carries the same rhythm across incompatible surfaces. The machine insists that the landscapes are connected even when they feel opposed. This is the deeper beauty of a single gear. It makes continuity visible. The city and the dirt are usually treated as separate categories: urban and rural, built and natural, civilized and wild, controlled and chaotic. But the actual experience of riding through real places complicates these binaries. The dirt path may be full of industrial rubble, the city street may be lined with trees, the canal towpath may be both infrastructure and ecosystem, the railway embankment may be a corridor for foxes, commuters, graffiti writers, and cyclists looking for a shortcut. The urban edge is not a clean border, it is a messy gradient. Tracklocross thrives in that gradient. It is a discipline of in-betweenness. It does not belong to road cycling, cyclocross, gravel, mountain biking, or traditional fixed gear culture. It borrows from all of them. That is part of its charm. It is a liminal form of riding for liminal spaces. It makes sense under bridges, along broken paths, through parks, around industrial estates and across those muddy strips that are too rough for a road bike but too ordinary to count as an official adventure. It is cycling in the margins on a bike that refuses to be completely appropriate. When the machine is not perfectly suited, the rider has to become more involved. This does not mean suffering for its own sake, although there will always be a suspicious little gobbling of suffering hidden in cycling culture. It means that limitation can bring the rider closer to the world. A fixed gear bike on mixed terrain requires constant interpretation. It makes the rider aware of cadence, tension, line choice, body position, surface texture and momentum. It makes the route less consumable and more participatory. On descents, the fixed gear becomes especially expressive. The legs must keep up with the wheel, which can make speed feel intimate, almost invasive. On rough dirt, this can become comic, terrifying, or strangely elegant depending on the day, the ratio, and the rider's relationship with self-preservation. The point is not that fixed is better, the point is that it is more insistent. It makes speed something the body must process directly. It does not let the rider become a passenger. On climbs, the lack of gears produces another form of truth. There is no shifting into an easier ratio to preserve comfort. The rider must work with momentum, line choice and body position. On loose climbs, force has to be applied carefully. Stamp too hard and traction disappears. Hesitate too much and momentum dies. The climb becomes a negotiation between power and delicacy, which is a rather elegant punishment. On corners, especially where tarmac becomes gravel or gravel becomes mud, the fixed gear adds another layer of timing. Pedal strike, cadence, traction and line all matter. The rider cannot always coast with the outside pedal dropped in the familiar way. They must manage the rhythm of the cranks through the turn, adjusting pressure while staying light enough to let the tyres find grip. This gives fixed gear off-road its peculiar dance quality. It is not smooth in the polished sense, it is alive. This is a gift of the urban escape route. It changes perception. You may ride the same roads home, but they no longer feel total. You know where the tarmac breaks. You know where the hidden paths begin. You know that beyond the traffic lights and office box there is a strip of mud where the bike becomes awkward, the body wakes up, and the ride stops being merely transport. The knowledge remains. It turns the everyday environment into a map of possible exits. The fixed gear bike is central to this because it makes the exit feel earned, not in the macho sense, but in the sensory sense. You do not glide out of the city as a detached observer. You pedal out through resistance. You feel every compromise. You arrive at the dirt already implicated in the route. The bike does not carry you away from the city so much as thread you through its weak points. And once the city becomes fabric, the hidden dirt route extends that analog quality into geography. It resists the smooth digital logic of navigation where the route appears as a clean line on a glowing screen. In reality, the best escape routes are often found through curiosity, repetition, local knowledge, and bodily memory. They involve getting somewhere slightly wrong. They involve following a path that may or may not go anywhere. They involve discovering that the promising dirt track ends at a locked gate, a swamp, or a dog with very strong opinions on your presence. This is not inefficiency as failure, it is exploration as method. There is something deeply valuable in that, especially now with so much of contemporary life is pre-routed. Recommendations arrive before desire has fully formed. Maps calculate the efficient path. Feeds anticipate intention. Apps convert movement into data. The fixed gear dirt transition resists this, not by making a grand speech, but by making the rider deal with the immediate world. The body has to solve what the algorithm cannot feel: a slippery route, a blind corner, a patch of mud, the exact amount of pressure that keeps the rear wheel gripping. That kind of riding returns intelligence to the body. That phrase may sound abstract or elitist, but the experience is concrete. The rider learns through sensation. Not all knowledge arrives as a sentence. Some knowledge arrives as a memory of nearly washing out on a wet corner and correcting just in time. Some knowledge arrives as the instinct to unweight the saddle before a rough patch. Some knowledge arrives as the quiet confidence of knowing how much speed to carry from tarmac onto gravel. Fixed gear Tracklocross is full of this unspectacular intelligence. It is not glamorous. The urban escape artist is therefore not simply a rider seeking dirt. They are someone cultivating a different relationship with place, machine, and attention. They are not trying to conquer the landscape, they are trying to hear it more clearly. The fixed gear helps because it removes some of the noise. It strips the bicycle back until the remaining signals become harder to ignore. Your chain, tyre, pedals, breath, surface, they are all the vocabulary you need. Of course, this whole thing remains slightly absurd. This absurdity should be embraced. There's a comedy in taking a fixed gear bike into muddy corridors where a sensible person might prefer gears, clearance, freewheel, brakes, suspension, or at least a less questionable life philosophy. But that absurdity keeps the concept honest. Without humour, the idea could become too solemn, too pleased with itself, too ready to turn every puddle into a metaphysical revelation. The better tone is serious play. The ride means something, yes, but it is also a person on a bicycle getting dirty in a place behind an industrial estate. This is where the sacred and the stupid meet.